I'm Elizabeth Puranam and this is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, nuclear power is back in the energy debate. Many nations are expanding their fleet of atomic plants. So is it on the verge of a renaissance? The EU has pledged billions of dollars to cash-strapped Egypt and upgraded their relationship to a strategic partnership. So what's behind the deal? And TikTok faces a ban in the US over national security concerns, but the measure could hit creators and businesses where it hurts most. Critics say atomic plants are dangerous, expensive, and take a long time to build. But nuclear power is being touted by some as a clean source of energy. Well, many nations aiming to decarbonise are now building new reactors, which are mainly supplied by China and Russia. And 22 countries pledged to triple their nuclear capacity by 2050 at the COP28 climate summit last year. The International Atomic Energy Agency expects global nuclear power generation to reach an all-time high next year. It says investment will need to more than double to $100 billion by 2030 to meet the Paris Agreement climate target. So let's take a look at the expansion of nuclear plants. Leading the race is China with 23 reactors under construction. India has 7. Turkey has 4, but the United States remains the top producer of nuclear power. It's investing billions of dollars in new technologies such as small modular reactors known as SMRs. They're easier, cheaper to build and offer flexibility for locations unable to accommodate traditional larger reactors. SMRs are fueled with low-enriched uranium. Russia dominates this market with almost half the world's commercial capacity. There are only 2 major Western suppliers of enrichment services. They are France's Orano and Urenco, which is a UK, German and Dutch consortium. China has built enrichment capacity to meet its own needs. Now, in parts of Europe, there is still resistance to nuclear energy. Germany, Italy and Lithuania have phased out nuclear power for electricity generation over environmental concerns and fears of another accident such as Japan's Fukushima disaster in 2011. But elsewhere, there is renewed interest in nuclear power amid the global energy crisis and carbon neutral goals. The International Atomic Energy Agency expects up to 13 countries to start producing electricity from nuclear power within the next few years, and they include Bangladesh and Egypt. The IAEA is calling on global development banks to fund new projects, warning that a failure to invest in nuclear power could delay the energy transition. World leaders have gathered in Brussels for the first nuclear energy summit. Hashim Al-Bara reports.
This summit is a remarkable indication of the changing political landscape globally. A few years ago in Europe, for example, the trend was basically to scrap nuclear plants, reactors and move to renewable energy. Except that 3 key factors converged and made this change of heart to happen. Climate change and people concerned about the future, war in Ukraine, the Europeans saying that it was about time to diversify themselves away from Russian imports, and their concern about the volatility of the energy market and particularly the potential for more conflicts and wars in the Middle East. So they said that there's absolutely no way we can rely on renewable energy and that the only way out for us to be able to move to more sustainable economy is to expand the nuclear energy capacity in different parts of the world. The problem that 2 key players, for example, the French and the Germans, don't see eye to eye when it comes to this. The French are further expanding, the Germans shut down all their remaining reactors. Spain is following suit with the Germans, but however, you have many other countries like Hungary, Czechia, and many other countries in Europe expanding and building more reactors. So how to narrow the differences between these countries? There is a hope that in this summit they would be able to convince many global key players and rich countries to put more investments into the small modular reactors and the advanced modular reactors. These are very small reactors that require less investments and whose safety features are more improved. But you know, you have to get to the point where that you can establish a vast chain of supply to be able to commercialize those reactors and make them available in the market. And that's the hope for for the world leaders meeting at this summit, which is basically to get to the point where by 2050 they reach the target of saying that we're finally climate neutral. Hashim Ahbara, Al Jazeera for Counting the Cost, Brussels.
Joining us now from Paris is Paul Dorfman. He's the founder and chair of the Nuclear Consulting Group. Thank you very much for your time, Mr. Dorfman. So as world leaders meet for the first nuclear summit, why is atomic energy back in the debate?
It's actually difficult to understand why nuclear is back in the debate. It could be basically, it's a bit of a last chance gasp for nuclear. Renewables about 4 to 5 times cheaper than new nuclear. 87% of all new electricity generation capacity worldwide in 2023 was new renewables, with nuclear nowhere. And all of the key energy institutes, organizations worldwide, including the International Energy Institute, say that renewables will do the heavy lifting for net zero.
So why then is the International Atomic Energy Agency and a few others saying that nuclear is so important if the world is to transition, to cleaner energy?
Well, I mean, the head of the IAEA has just met with Bashar al-Assad, the Syrian dictator, in Damascus to agree on a new engagement between the IAEA and Syria. Russia is a major player in global civil nuclear. So there are some significant questions to ask about the relative morality of this nuclear push.
It is being touted as a clean or a cleaner energy source, is it not?
Well, if you take into consideration uranium mining, transport, processing, the operation, decommissioning, waste, then absolutely not. And then if you then go on to think about accidents, incidents, Chernobyl, Fukushima, 3 Mile Island, and the risks involved. I mean, we know what's been happening in Zaporizhia, where by the grace of God, according to the US, we've escaped a disaster. So there's some very real questions associated with this nuclear push, which is, to a certain extent, largely PR.
Okay, so you're certainly questioning the International Atomic Energy Agency and their agenda, but what about institutions like the International Energy Agency? They spoke in January of the importance, they said, of the nuclear comeback to meet the increase in global electricity demands.
Yeah, but the International Energy Agency themselves say that renewables will do the heavy lifting. And if you want to talk about sort of substantive institutes, the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, states quite clearly that we have to really get our emissions down by 2030. Now, the IPCC also say that renewables are 10 times better than nuclear at mitigating CO2. And then let's go back to COP28. Now, the big news on COP28 for nuclear was that nuclear wanted to be expanded 3 times by 2050. That's 3 times by 2050. The same COP28 said they wanted renewables expanded by 3 times by 2030. So nuclear 2050, renewables by 2030. Now, what does that actually mean? That means nuclear 1.2 terawatts by 2050 and renewables 11.5 terawatts by 2030. So according to the science, nuclear is still marginal.
Okay, you mentioned, Zaporizhia in Ukraine. How do you think that, how do you assess the defenses at the moment to mitigate nuclear accidents in countries that use nuclear power, especially as there is such a big push for it at the moment?
There is a PR push. I mean, that's for sure. Whether it's a kind of a last chance gasp for nuclear to put in structures, policy, finance before the obvious advantages of renewables is too obvious to deny. But in terms of what we have, it's actually very difficult to defend nuclear. There's no way militarily that you can defend a nuclear site. And in an increasingly unstable world, that could be a problem. More specifically, when one thinks about climate, nuclear has to be situated by the coast, large bodies of water or river. We know what's going to happen with our coast. What's going to happen is that sea levels will rise, but the key concern is storm surge, where basically under certain atmospheric conditions, the sea basically ups and moves inland. So the real problem with nuclear is that it may actually prove to be a climate casualty, and a significant climate casualty.
There are, of course, many other challenges, isn't there? There are so many reactors that are supposed to be being built right now that are in a number of countries that are delayed, that are costing many times as much as they were supposed to. We are seeing a lot being made of small modular reactors. Do you think that they mitigate any of the challenges posed by the traditional larger reactors?
It's certainly true that large reactors are hugely overcost and hugely over time, and nuclear can only be built with vast public subsidy, which is why you're seeing nuclear being built in command and control states like Russia and China, and to a certain extent an outlier, UEA, and perhaps the UK. Now, the issue about SMRs, or small modular reactors, basically there's not one SMR in commercial production anywhere in the world. It simply doesn't exist. SMRs are still in development. The great hope of SMRs was NuScale SMR in the US, and that went almost bankrupt a few weeks ago and is off the card. So there's some very real questions associated with SMRs, not least the question of proliferation and security and safety.
Mr. Dorfman, thank you very much for your expertise on this. Paul Dorfman of the Nuclear Consulting Group in Paris.
Thank you.
Now, a drought in southern Africa is affecting food production, with crops dying from a lack of water. Zambia's government has declared a national disaster, and the rest of the region is also under pressure. Haru Mutasa reports from Harare.
Rains have been erratic for months in Zambia. Some farmers are now improvising to try and help their crops survive the heat. The drought has been declared a national disaster by the government.
We've invested $5,000. We expect at this rate, hopefully we can break even 5,000. But that is a loss, okay? The rest of the farmers who might have not been able to save their crop are facing 100% loss of their investments.
The drought is also affecting mining and limiting electricity generation from hydropower. Zambia, Africa's second largest copper producer, plans to import and ration power. According to the World Food Programme, Botswana, southern Malawi, eastern Angola, and parts of Mozambique and Zimbabwe are also in trouble. Maize is the staple food in Zimbabwe and the rest of southern Africa. As it gets hotter and drier across the region, many more families will need help to keep themselves fed. Zimbabwe's government is working with aid agencies to assist communities. People living in drier regions are some of the most vulnerable.
My maize crop was a disaster. I have 2 fields. All the crops are dead.
But resources aren't enough to help everybody.
Funding has been a challenge, and it will continue to be a challenge because the resources are not always available. So the current needs get up to about 43 million, of which only 35% of that budget is funded for WFP. So you can see that we actually have a huge resource gap.
The drought is expected to slow down the economic growth of countries in the region, and food prices are continuing to rise. That's making life even more difficult for millions of people in southern Africa who are already struggling. Haru Mutasa, Al Jazeera, for Counting the Cost, Harare.
Egypt is an important supplier of natural gas to Europe. The African nation is also a transit route for migrants seeking to cross to the continent. The EU is worried conflicts in Gaza and Sudan could drive more refugees to its shores and worsen financial troubles in Egypt, which plays a vital role in regional stability. The bloc has announced more than $8 billion in aid to the cash-strapped nation and upgraded its relationship with Cairo.
Today marks a historic milestone. With the signature of our joint declaration for a strategic and comprehensive partnership, And given your political and economic weight, as well as your strategic location in a very troubled neighbourhood, the importance of our relations will only increase over time.
The deal comes amid concerns Israel's planned ground offensive on the region of Rafah and Gaza could force hundreds of thousands of people into Egypt's Sinai Peninsula. Egypt already hosts more than 9 million migrants and refugees. President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi reiterated his nation's commitment to curbing illegal migration.
The discussions addressed the importance of continuing to confront common challenges, most notably illegal immigration, as we affirmed our commitment to combating this phenomenon.
The deal is the latest in a series of agreements between the EU and North African countries aimed at stopping the flow of people across the Mediterranean to Europe. $5 billion is for macro-financial assistance. That's a loan the EU is offering with low interest rates and favourable terms to help stabilise Egypt's flailing economy. A mix of grants and loans paid over 3 years will allow Egypt to better protect its borders, particularly with Libya. It's a key transit point for people fleeing war and poverty in Africa and the Middle East. And EU funds will support Egypt in hosting almost 500,000 refugees from Sudan. Most have fled the nearly year-long conflict there. Rights groups have condemned the deal. Human Rights Watch criticised what it labelled the EU's cash for migration control approach, saying it strengthens authoritarian rulers while betraying human rights defenders, journalists, lawyers and activists whose work involves great personal risk. Joining us now from Doha is Ahmed Hilal. He's an economic and political risk analyst and Middle East and North Africa director at the Global Council. Thank you for your time, Mr. Hilal. It's often said that Egypt is just too big to be allowed to fail, isn't it? How important is its economic, its political stability to the region?
Well, Egypt's economy, the size of its population, its proximity to Europe, and its importance to the mediation process in the Israel-Palestine conflict means that Europe couldn't witness a place like Egypt descend into greater economic turmoil, especially as we've seen increasing numbers of Egyptians use Libya as a country of embarkation for European-bound irregular migration. And let's not forget that before the 7 billion package from the EU was approved, Egypt's economy was on the brink. And when the IMF approved its loan earlier this month, an $8 billion loan, the EU felt that it was confident that Egypt was going into a direction of economic reform, and the IMF approval was a seal of approval, and that the EU could feel confident that it could extend this aid to Egypt.
Especially because the IMF loan was, of course, dependent on Egypt floating its currency, wasn't it? EU deal, just the latest. You mentioned the IMF, the United Arab Emirates, investing billions of dollars. Just how much will these grants, these loans, these investments help the Egyptian economy, not just in the short term, but in the long term?
Between the IMF and the EU and the World Bank and the Emirati pledge, Egypt has now received close to $57 billion of financial pledges. And this will be enough for Egypt to meet its hard currency requirements in the short and medium term. In the long term, Egypt will need to make more difficult choices. It will need to reduce spending on projects with questionable economic returns, and it will need to develop its export economy. Egypt imports a lot more than its exports, which is what caused this funding squeeze and this foreign exchange crisis. And more importantly, Egypt will need to create a level playing field between the state and the private sector so that it becomes a more competitive economy.
Yeah, and a lot of criticism of the military in the state's finances, isn't there? You touched on what's happening over Egypt's border with Gaza. Just how worried is the European Union about what's happening in Gaza and what that could mean for the flow of refugees into the continent?
Well, Europe is worried about a couple of things with regards to Gaza. Of course, there's the displacement of Palestinians if Israel decides to launch an operation into Rafah. There will be a high risk of displacement into Egypt, which will create more economic pressure on Egypt. And of course, Europe is trying to stem migration. It has pursued a policy of border externalization by working with southern Mediterranean states to police their coasts better and to have better screening processes at European shores when those migrants have arrived. And we shouldn't forget that this is in the context of European elections in the summer, where migration is a very polarizing issue and where you have right-leaning parties on the ascendancy in Europe.
And the European Union, the policy that you're speaking of, the externalization of security when it comes to refugees and migrants, it's been criticized before, and the European Union's own rights watchdog has criticized the latest deal, saying that it falls short on human rights safeguards. How effective are such deals?
Well, this is a debate between values-based versus security-based approach to asylum seekers and irregular migration. The resources that Europe is plowing into Northern African economies, I see it as treating the symptoms and not the root cause. The root cause is economic mismanagement and conflict happening from the Sahel to North Africa to East Africa, and economies that are failing. So these are much harder issues to solve, and so Europe opts for band-aid solutions, helping to stem migration using a security-based approach.
And just lastly, Mr. Hilal, given that 2/3 of Egyptians are currently living under the poverty line, how much do you think that all of these latest grants, these loans, will help the average Egyptian?
Well, it's hard to see an immediate impact of this, to this trickling down to the ordinary Egyptian. Egyptians have been suffering from 3 shocks: the pandemic, the loss of tourism arrivals from the pandemic, and you have the Suez Canal, a reduction of revenues. So, and then you have geopolitical conflicts encircling Egypt and Libya and Sudan and Gaza. So, in terms of long-term, Egypt will need to have structural reform to address a trade deficit and a debt burden that is dragging the Egyptian people down and causing inflation and eroding their quality of life and increasing the poverty levels that you discuss.
Ahmed Hilal, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
TikTok has brought artists and influencers overnight fame. The app is one of the most popular social media platforms with 170 million users a month in the United States alone. But it's owned by Chinese company ByteDance, and the US says the firm's ties with Beijing threatens national security. The Senate could soon pass a bill to ban TikTok if the Chinese owner doesn't sell its stake. Well, content creators and millions of businesses who make a living posting videos could be affected. TikTok says more than 7 million small businesses in the US advertise products on its app, generating nearly $15 billion in revenue a year. The food and drinks industry and the health and wellness sector advertise most on the platform, and Amazon is the largest single advertiser on TikTok in the US. It invested $22 million in ads in 2022, followed by television network HBO, which spent $19 million. Well, joining us now from London is Willy Ledon-Werter. He's a professor of economic sociology and digital social research at the University of Oxford and author of the book Cloud Empires. Thank you very much for your time. Firstly, can you briefly talk us through how people make money on TikTok?
Well, there's a few different ways that people make money on TikTok. But TikTok does pay some content creators on the basis of views. But the payouts tend to be smaller than on, for example, YouTube. Creators can also receive virtual gifts from viewers, which translate into additional payouts. But creators tend to make the most money by producing sponsored videos that advertise products. And creators can also directly sell their own merchandise.
Okay. Around 1/3 of US adults use TikTok. We know it's especially popular among young adults, and TikTok says that 7 million small businesses in the US use the app. So what is at stake for creators and for businesses?
TikTok has been especially important for small businesses to find new consumers. And it's been important for a lot of creators who produce the sort of content that goes viral and follows trends and appeals to the kind of mass personalization algorithm that TikTok is built on.
Can the content creators and businesses have the same success on other platforms like YouTube, like Instagram?
They absolutely could. Or let's say if TikTok disappeared today, Instagram and YouTube would probably pick up most of the business. But it's not necessarily the same businesses, the same advertisers and the same creators that would thrive on Instagram and YouTube, because TikTok, as mentioned, is all about appealing to the algorithm and following these hyper fast changing trends, whereas the other platforms are a little bit more about cultivating an audience of regular followers. So the total size of the pie probably wouldn't shrink that much if TikTok suddenly disappeared out of the scene, but there would be a bit of a redistribution of income from some creators to others, and some small businesses would probably lose out and others possibly gain.
Okay, so on the redistribution, how much would a TikTok ban benefit other social media companies?
Well, TikTok's share of, for instance, video ad spend in the US, according to data from eMarketer, is about 6%. And YouTube's is about 8%, and Meta's, which includes Instagram and Facebook, is about 30%. So we're not talking about a huge part of the pie, but still noticeable. And then when it comes to the creator economy, it's much harder to say because there aren't really reliable statistics available on it.
Yeah, TikTok's finances aren't publicly disclosed. Just what kind of response, lastly, can we expect from China if TikTok is indeed banned in the US?
Well, China already heavily restricts foreign media ownership. So, for instance, Apple's media platforms like Apple TV and Apple Books are already not available in China, and YouTube is not available in China. Instagram is not available in China. So the potential for sort of tit-for-tat response seems pretty limited. But of course, China could respond in some completely different way, and this could easily accelerate the so-called tech war between US and China that's so far been playing out in microchips and 5G networks and cloud data centers, because both superpowers view the global success of their tech firms as essential to geopolitical power today.
Willy Leedon-Werter, thank you so much for shedding light on this for us. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth.
And that is our show for this week. Get in touch with us on X, formerly known as Twitter. I'm at Liz Puranam. Do use the hashtag AJCTC when you do, or drop us an email. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our address. And there's more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That'll take you straight to our page, which has individual reports, links, and entire episodes for you to catch up on. And that's it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Elizabeth Puranam from the whole team. Thank you for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.